Hey, this is God's Big Toe from God's Big Toes Poker Coaching Community coming at you with our next video called The Basics. We're going to cover a lot of things in this video, but here's a little overview of what is going to be talked about today. Some basic terminology, things like hand rankings, position at the table, bet sizes, stack sizes, basic odds and how to calculate them, note taking and color coding, bankroll management, sit and goes versus MTTs versus satellites versus cash game, game and site selection, and best practices. All right, before we can start playing poker, we need to know what beats what. There is a chart of all the different poker hands in order of what beats what. First, we have high card. That means when the board plays out, we don't have any sort of pair. Our highest card is the best thing we got. In this example down here, it is king high. So if anybody has a bear ace in their hand, they have us beat. Next is the one pair hands, pretty obvious. There is a 7 in your hand and a 7 comes on the board. We have one pair, two pair beats one pair, three of a kind beating two pair, three of the same cards, 2-2-2, for example. You have two twos in your hand and a 2 comes on the flop. You have 1-2 in your hand and two twos come on the flop. Three of a kind. Straight is any cards in numerical order. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10, jack, queen, king, ace. Flush is 5 cards, all of the same suit. Hearts, clubs, spades, or diamonds. Full house is the next one on the list. That is a 3 of a kind and a pair. So if you had 8-2 in your hand and the flop came down to 2-8, you would have a full house. Conversely, if it comes down 2-2-2 and you have a pair of 8s in your hand, you have a full house as well. 4 of a kind is 4 of the same card, 7-7, 7-7, ace, 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 ace. Straight flush are 5 cards that are in numerical order and all of the same suit. And the royal flush, which is really just the best straight flush, the 10, jack, queen, king, ace of the same suit. The highest straight flush possible being the highest hand in the game. So I thought I would list some basic terminology, and there's a few slides of this where I would list some of the common things you'll see as you're getting started. And as I go down this list, we'll bring up some examples and dive deeper into each item. So we'll kick this off with SNG. SNG stands for Sit and Go. Sit and Go is a tournament that will kick off when a certain number of players join it. So there's such a thing like a 9-man sit and go, which means when the first 9 players join that tournament, it kicks off, and it plays a lot like an MTT, which I'll go into some depth after this, but it plays a lot like that style of tournament at that point, and then you play down to a winner. And the more players in the sit and go, the more winners will get paid. So there's usually 9-mans, 18-mans, 27-mans, 36-mans, and 45-mans. Those are the general sit and goes that you'll see. And you'll know they go up by 9s because the average poker table is 9-handed. MTT stands for Multi-Table Tournament. Basically, this is a tournament that has more than 9 players, more than the one table. And so, unlike the sit and go, this one usually goes off at a certain time of day. And certain sites have certain tournaments that run every day. Certain sites have certain tournaments that only run on certain days, but they're always a scheduled time. And then there's no limit on how many players can enter this tournament. And what will happen is there will be the blind levels, and those blind levels will go up in certain amounts of time. And they'll get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the players will get fewer and fewer. And then these tournaments tend to pay out somewhere between 10 and 15% of all the players that enter it in the given registration time. You'll notice that these MTTs will have something called late registration as well. And basically what happens is it's scheduled to go off on Tuesday at noon, and it'll have a certain amount of late registration, which means that even though it technically already started, people can still join up until a certain amount of time. A lot of times it's either 1 hour, 3 hours, or 5 hours after the tournament starts. People can still register for those things. And once that time period ends, then they'll determine how many players entered and pay out that prize pool. That brings us to satellite tournaments now. Satellite tournaments play just like an MTT, but the thing is you'll buy in for a certain amount, let's say $2, and what it'll do is it'll pay out tickets to a higher buy-in tournament at a later time. So unlike MTTs and sit and goes, when you, depending on where you place, you get a certain amount of money. In the satellite, what'll happen for the $2, let's say it pays 10 players, you'll play down to 10 players, and then those 10 players will get a ticket to a $10 tournament, let's say. And it's a cheap way to get into bigger events to try and take a shot at winning more money for your bank. When it comes down to MTTs and satellites, there are a few different types of these types of tournaments. There is the free roll, which costs you nothing to play, and generally there's a small amount of money up top that you can try and win for absolutely no investment. There is a rebuy. Now, what that is when you join a tournament, you get tournament chips. So for an $11 tournament, you will buy in, and for that $11, you'll get 5,000 tournament chips. And so with the rebuy tournament, what you can do is you can click that rebuy button generally right before, even before the tournament starts, except on global poker where you have to bust first. That's one example where you have to rebuy. But what'll happen is once you do that, you'll get double your starting chips. So your 5,000 starting chips will now become 10,000 starting chips, and off you go. Another thing with rebuy tournaments is at the end of a given late registration period, like we talked about earlier, what'll happen is they'll have another thing called an add-on. And for a certain price, you'll get an additional starting stack of 5,000 chips. So you'll get a chance to run your 10,000 chips, let's say, if you start off and rebuy and play to the end of the late registration. You said, you know what, I'm going to use some extra chips in my stack to try and go super deep in this thing. You'll get an option to buy one more chunk of chips before the late registration ends. And once that is done, there'll be no more rebuys. Re-entry is kind of similar. With re-entry, generally, there's not an add-on at the end of late registration. And the other difference is with the rebuy tournament, if you buy into an $11 tournament, there's something called the rake. And so what it is 10 of that dollars goes toward the prize pool for everyone to get paid, assuming they get down to that 10 or 15%. And that extra dollar goes to paying the website that you're playing on, or the casino for that matter, for their operating costs. Internet, servers, programmers, all those things are paid for by the rake. And so now that we know what the rake is, when you're in a rebuy tournament and you buy in for your $11 initial cost, and then you decide to rebuy, it doesn't cost you an $11. It costs you $10 because you generally pay rake on a rebuy. You don't pay rake on the add-on either. In the re-entry, when you buy in for $11, it's actually a second entry into that tournament, so you do pay that rake an extra amount of time, and that little bit adds up. It definitely makes a difference in your overall bankroll, and so you should keep that in mind when having a rebuy versus re-entry strategy. A freeze-out tournament is when you buy in, you get your starting stack. Let's say you buy in for $5.50, and you get your 10,000 chip starting stack. What happens there is once you are out of chips, you are out of that tournament. There is no rebuys, there's no add-ons, there's no re-entries. It is a freeze-out. Once you're out, you are gonzo. That brings us to the cash game, also known as ring game. The difference in the cash game is that there is no registration time. There is no late reg. You can sit down and play poker anytime you want. There will be a certain blind level, and the cheapest one online is 1 cent, 2 cent. And that means that the 1 cent is the small blind and the 2 cent is the big blind. And we'll cover that a little bit deeper later. But there is no time period where these will ever go up. You sit down, you play your 1 cent, 2 cent, and you get up whenever you're ready. The other difference here is when you buy in for, let's say, $100 in a cash game, you're not getting tournament chips like the satellite, MTT, or sit and go. That $100 is a real $100, and every dollar you lose off of that stack is real money that either goes in or comes out of your pocket. There is a rake for ring games as well, and generally they'll take like $1 off of it. When it's $1, $3 blinds, they'll take $1 off. Or they do it sometimes depending on the size of the pot. They'll take a certain percentage off the top, and that again pays for operating costs. Now we're going to get into actual gameplay type stuff. And we're going to start that off with position, and that means where you're sitting at the table in relation to the blinds and in relation to the dealer button. And I'll bring up some examples, and we'll take a good look at that right now. So here's a good diagram of positions at the table. And basically what happens is we always start with the small blind. The small blind is going to have to put in a certain amount of money every time, and that amount is usually going to be half amount of the big blind. So generally when you're playing an MTT, a sit and go, the tournament will start with $10, $20 blinds, and so the small blind will put in 10 and the big blind will put in 20. In a cash game, it's the same thing. You'll be playing $1, $2, for example. Small blind will put in $1, big blind will put in $2. In both cash games and all the tournament types, what will happen is you'll see the dealer button right over here. That button will move along the table to the left after every hand, and all these positions will shift to the left one spot after every hand, and that way every person at this table will get a chance to play each position. Small blind is generally the weakest position at the table, and the reason being is because once the 3 cards come down, it's called the flop. And on the flop, you are going to be the first person to act. So everyone else who's in the hand is going to get to see what you do before they have to make a decision about what they're going to do. Next position is the big blind. Like I said, that is going to be twice the small blind, and they're pretty much in this hand, no matter what. And if one of the other positions just calls, they're going to call whatever that blind amount is. So an example where it's 10, 20, if you want to play this hand, you have to put at least 20 chips into the pot in order to play in that example. Under the gun and under the gun 1 are considered, and the blinds as well actually, all considered early position. And early position, you want to play what's called tighter. You want to be really selective with the hands you choose to play in these positions. Again, because you're going to be what's called out of position for the rest of the hand. Everyone else is going to have that advantage of you, that positional advantage of knowing what you're going to do first. And so you want to definitely be tighter, especially as you get to smaller stacks. There is some argument for maybe playing a little bit more hands, being wider from these positions when you have a lot of chips, but generally speaking, you do want to play a tighter range. Middle position, our hands can get a little bit better. We don't have to get through as many people at the table, and if anyone else is in the hand before us, we have that positional advantage. Hijack, cutoff, and dealer button, late position. This is part of what's called in the box. Hijack, cutoff, dealer, small blind, big blind. That's called the box. That's where the most bluffing happens and where people are the weakest. The blinds are the weakest because they were forced to be in this hand for some amount of chips, and they didn't get to look at their cards first. The hijack, the cutoff, and the dealer, they tend to be really wide in their hand ranges, the range of cards they're choosing to play in those positions, because they're going to get a lot of folds when they raise in these spots. Not that many people to get past, so they tend to be wider. And people like to take advantage of the people in the blinds because, like I said, they're in without even looking at their cards. They're going to be weak most of the time. So the cutoff, the dealer, and the hijack are trying to steal those blinds a lot of the time. Okay, so we've covered sit and goes, MTTs, satellites, free rolls, rebuys, re-entry, freeze outs, cash game, ring game, buy-in, rake, position, big blind, small blind. Let's kick it off to flop, turn, and river, otherwise known as streets. So here's a real life example of a hand I played. It's a random one I picked out. You can see my whole cards here is a pair of sixes, also known as pocket sixes. And let's see how the action unfolds, and we'll talk it through. So here I am sitting in the cutoff. We looked at that map before. And what happens is we have the dealer button, which is the spot right here. The small blind for 125. And the big blind for 250 in this tournament. And then what happens is whoever is the first person sitting past the big blind is the first person to act under the gun, and they have to decide whether they're going to bet or fold. Let's see what they do. There's a fold. Under the gun +1 also folds. River Dawn, sitting in middle position, decides to limp. Limping is a term for just calling. Not something that I generally suggest when playing poker. If you're the first person to put chips in a pot, you should be raising 100%. And when you're the first person raising, that's also called opening the pot as well. This is generally a weak play. The Mighty Hef in middle position as well. Follows suit. Limping does seem to be contagious out there. Noon folds in the cutoff. We're sitting in the hijack now. I'm sorry, I have that backwards. Noon folds in the hijack. We're sitting in the cutoff now with a pair of sixes. And I'm going to do what's called an isolation raise, which means I am going to raise the people here who just limped in because that's a weak play, like I said. And I think I have the best hand a lot. And I think I could take it down here quite a bit. When I don't take it down with the isolation raise, what it is going to do is it's generally going to get the guy on the button, the small blind, the big blind, and sometimes one of the limpers to fold, which isolates me down to only playing against one or two players. And, that works to my advantage. The more players that are in the hand, the more cards are out there, the more people can hit flops, turns, and rivers. And, we want to try and make this as easy as possible to play. So we see a fold from the guy sitting in the hijack seat. In the cutoff, like I said, I'm going to isolation raise this. The way to decide what size that's going to be is my normal opening raise is going to be 3 times the blinds, so 750 chips. And then I'm going to add 1 blind for everyone who limped. So 750 plus 250 is 1,000, and plus another 250 is 1,250. So my range size should be somewhere between 1,000 and 1,250 here. And there it is. Poker Lord comes along here. This is called a flat when you just call. He flats us. It's also called an overcall when there's a bunch of action in front and you still flat. Not to get too confusing though, we do get some isolation when the small blind and the big blind fold. River Dawn flats, Mighty Hef flats, and we see a flop. On a flop like this, I know that I'm going to check. Let's see what River Dawn does. He's the one closest to the big blind, so he's the first to act. He does check. Mighty Hef checks as well. Here's our check as we promised. Poker Lord on the button. Checks. And we see that turn card. River Dawn's still first to act. And everyone's still checking. I'm going to check too. Poker Lord checks. And that river card brings an ace. More checking ensues. The interesting thing about this hand is when it checks on the turn, it checks on the flop, checks on the turn, checks on the river by these two guys, they never have an ace or a 7 in their hand. If they did, they'd want to try and get value from that and try and win some extra chips. The problem when there's 2 aces and 2 7s on this board, my pair of 6s get what's called counterfeited, which means that now I'm playing 2 aces, 2 7s, and a 6, because my 6 is higher than that too. And that's not really good enough to win here. Any 8, 9, 10, jack, queen, king, all beat our hand now. I'm going to bet this and bet it kind of big because their action looks pretty weak. So I do lead out and put a bet out there. There it is. The pot is 4,600. We bet for about 2/3 pot, 3,450. Poker Lord folds. River Dawn folds. Mighty Hef folds. And we scoop the chippies into our stack. Here's one more hand example, a random one that I picked out that's a good one for stack sizes, effective stack sizes, and pots versus side pots. So let's see how the action goes and we'll talk it out. We see a raise from early middle position. And we have a very short stack. We have about 12 blinds or so. And on this stack size, the only thing I can really do is get all in with my pair of 10s. So my actual stack is 1850. The 5500 guy, when he decides to call or not, he's not calling to double his stack. He's calling to win 1850. So 1850 is the effective stack size when I jam here. I do. And here we see a re-raise for 48.95. Now the effective stack out there is 48.95, not 55.10. And playing smart and fold can decide to call this for a pot of 73.30. Now there's going to be a side pot here. What that means is because I only have 1850, I can't win the 5510 and the 4895 from our villains. I can only win 1850 from each of them. So one pot will be 5300 and change, 1850 times 3, and the other pot will go to whoever has the best hand between these two players. Does call. We see a board. Ace queen misses and ace 6 hits it. So 1,500 chips go to me. That is the main pot. The additional chips outside of that 1850 that I won is the side pot rather. That's 6,000 chips, and the side pot goes to play smart and fold with the ace 6. So I jump back to the start of this hand. One thing I forgot to talk about was the antes that are playing this hand. Basically, the way it works is in the early and middle stages of a tournament, as the blind levels increase, there will not be an ante. But after you start to get deeper in the tournament, antes start to come into play. And so what the ante is everyone sitting at the table has to put in a certain amount of chips. This one, the ante is 15 chips. And everyone puts in their 15 chips before the hand even starts. So you can see there's 135 chips in the middle here, right here. And those are everyone's antes before. Adds a little extra juice when we add that in on top of the blinds that are already in there. And so that makes the pot just a little bit more valuable and a little bit more worth fighting for. Once antes go into play, as the blind levels increase, the antes will increase as well. All these things go up too in order to kind of induce action and to really force people to make moves as they get short, all in an effort to keep the tournament kind of going in a timely fashion and make people have to get involved so they can't just sit and wait for aces every game. All right, jumping back over to our list, we've covered whole cards, checking, limping, flatting, opens, pots and side pots, stack size versus effective size, antes, blind levels, and deep stack versus turbo versus hyper turbo we didn't really talk about, but that's just a definition of the structure of the blind levels. Deep stacks usually start with bigger chip stacks, and they usually have longer blind levels, 10 or 15 minutes. Turbos tend to be 5-minute levels. The blinds go up every 5 minutes. And hyper turbos tend to be 3-minute levels, where the blinds go up every 3 minutes, making action happen really fast because people get really short stacked really quickly. All right, that brings us to all the different kinds of draws. We're going to bring you flush draws, open-ended straight draws, gut shot draws, and backdoor draws. Here's some examples. All right, here we are. I picked some random hands that were just good examples of all the different kinds of draws. We're starting here with the King Jack of clubs. This is also called suited gappers. They call it a suited gapper because there's a gap. There's no queen, right? There's a gap between the jack and the king. So also called suited paint. Paint are all face cards. Just some poker slang in there. The action's not going to matter too much. We're not going to go too deep into how to play the draws, just what they look like, and that sort of thing. So we do call with the King Jack. This is a flush draw. We have 2 clubs in our hand. There are 2 clubs on the board. We need 1 club to hit a flush. There's a bet. We come along. Now we have a flush. Flush is better than 3 queens. Bet get raised. We get all in. And our flush wins. King, queen down here and this guy. Oh, we just get it all in. But I use this as an example because this is what's called an open-ended straight draw. We have king, queen, and there's a jack 10 on the board. So we have king, queen, jack 10, either a 9 or an ace, both sides of it give us a straight. That is an open-ended straight draw. We'll run it out just for fun. We do hit the 9 on the river, and that gives us our straight. The best hand possible, 9, 10, jack, queen, king. Here it's a 4, 6. We see a flop. So this actually has 2 different draws in it. We have the flush draw, which we talked about earlier. We also have what's called a gut shot draw, which means 3, 4, 6, 7, and in the middle of that is the missing 5. When you're missing that middle card, that's called the gut shot draw. We need a 5 or a diamond to win this hand. All right, starting this off with ace king. This here is a couple of draws as well. We have that gut shot straight draw that we were talking about. We need a queen to get jack 10, queen, king, ace as a straight. We also have the king of hearts, which means we have what's called a backdoor draw. And that means if there's a heart on the turn and a heart on the river, we get our flush, quote unquote, through the back door. King 8 suited. This is another example of a backdoor draw. We actually have 2 backdoor draws here as well. We have 3 clubs right now. If we get a club on the turn and a club on the river, we get a backdoor flush draw. We also have the backdoor straight draw. 2 backdoor straight draws. If we get a 5 and a 6, we have the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 straight. And if we get the 10 and the jack, we have the 7, 8, 9, 10 jack straight. All right, moving right along, we're going to cover some bet sizes now and what those are called. Some of them I make, some of them are bet sizes we're facing, but it gets the point across. Here we see a guy raise to 60 chips. The big blind, as you can see right here, is 30. And so when he raises 60, this is called a min raise. He raises it for the minimum 1 more blind, 30 more chips. And that's what it looks like. Here you can see we have a pair of 4s and it folds to us. We pop it to 90 chips. That's 3 times the amount in the big blind. So this is 3xing. If we were to raise it to 120, that would be 4xing. If we were to raise it to 150, that would be 5xing. And it just kind of goes exponentially from there. This hand's going to cover 3 betting. A little bit different than 3xing. Sounds kind of similar. Not quite the same thing. Basically what a 3-bet is a re-raise. So, using this hand as an example, we see a raise in front and we have queens. We re-raise it, and that is called a 3-bet. If we were to see a raise on top of this one, that would be a 4-bet and then a 5-bet. And again, it goes up exponentially from there. Usually by a 5-bet, you're all in because you don't usually have enough chips to make that kind of a raise. So here's our 3-bet. We do see a 4-bet all in with the queens. And thought this was a great example of the 3-bet, 4-bet situation. And now that we've looked at 3xing and 3-betting, now we're going to look at double and 3-barrel betting. Here's a good example of that one. Again, we have the queens. There's our bet pre-flop. We do get a couple of callers. We bet on the flop. This is also known as a continuation bet. Turn card doesn't change much. We bet again. When we bet on the flop with our continuation bet, also known as a C-bet, and we bet on the turn, that is known as a double barrel. We're firing 2 bullets at this flop to try and get some value and or take it down depending on the situation. We do get called. And on the river, we have a choice to fire another bullet at it and bet again, and that would be a triple barrel. You do see the triple barrel, and there it is. All right, that brings us to our last topic in regards to betting, something called the donk bet. Here's an example of that. Basically what a donk bet is we're facing a raise, and we just call, or flat, like we discussed earlier. We see a flop, and Poker is the aggressor. He is the initiative, and even with that being the case, we're going to be the first to bet. So he bet, and we just called, and then we were first to act, and we led into him with a bet. That is called a donk lead. Another kind of donk lead could be something like a stop and go. Let me pull up that a stop and go situation and give you an example of that. All right, here we are with the 5 deuce. This is an example of something called a stop and go, which is also a donk lead as well. Again, we just call and hit a pair. And here we're going to lead into him like we discussed and take away that initiative that he has. But the stop and go is when we call and then jam on the flop, putting our chips all in. All right, looking back at our list, we covered pot, side pot, stack size versus effective stack size, antes, blind levels, deep stack, turbo, hyper turbos, all the different kinds of draws, min raise versus 3x versus 4x, 3-betting, aka the re-raise, the double and triple barrel, and the donk lead. Now we'll look at things like value and equity and odds and that sort of thing. Let's pick up some hand examples. So I found this hand, which has a good example of all those bullet points we were talking about. Here we have the queen 7, and we get to see a flop. We decide to check. We hit second pair with the 7 kicker, and what that means is the 7 is what describes how strong our pair or second pair or third pair is. So basically, if someone has a queen 8, queen 9, queen 10, queen jack, queen king, queen ace, they either have 2 pair or have a pair with a better kicker, and they would win the hand in this situation. So sometimes when playing poker, you want to keep your kicker in mind when deciding whether or not to bet. When we are facing someone with a better kicker, that is also known as being dominated. They are dominating our second pair hand with their better kicker, and we're in big trouble. Check. We do decide to check with our 7 kicker, and on the turn we pick up a flush draw. So our hand picks up equity. We have a more valuable hand now. It picks up more ways to win. We pick up more outs. Outs is a term used to describe how many cards we have that could come on either the turn, the flop, the river, wherever, that improves our hand in some way. So now we picked up all the clubs as outs. We also have the 7 as an out. Being that I picked up more equity in my hand, the hand is more valuable, I'm going to try and get value for my holding, which means I am going to bet. And we do get called and do pick up some value and with the river. So now we get to a spot where we have a hand that is okay. It's not bad. It's also not great. We have what's called showdown value. Showdown value means that we don't really have a good enough hand to bet here. If we do, there's not a lot worse that's going to call us. And so we're better off checking and making a decision then. Given these stack sizes, there is some argument for either jamming it or check jamming it. Jamming it means putting all your chips in the middle and going all in. But without going into too many semantics on how to play the hand, showdown value is the term of the day. He does check back. We realize that showdown value and take the chips. Here's a hand I picked out to talk about something called hand ranging. Hand ranging is what we do to try and figure out where our opponents are in a hand. Very few times in poker you could say, I know this guy has aces. I know this guy has ace king. I know he has kings. But often in poker you can say, well, he's got these aces, ace 10, ace jack, ace queen, ace king. He probably doesn't have these aces based on the action we're facing. And things of that nature. That's called hand ranging. And as you study and as you practice, your hand ranging skills will get sharper and sharper, and you'll be able to put people on hands, more effectively. Here's one I used as an example for that. We have the aces, and of course we are going to 3x open our aces in first position. We do see a person in the cutoff who flats, using all our new terminology. The big blind flats as well. We see a flop. This flop is really, really wet. Another term rather that we use in poker, wet flop, dry flop. This is the flop that's wet because it hits a lot of hands in a lot of ways. There's a flush draw, there's a lot of straight draws. Most people play the paint cards, Jack, 10, Queen, King, and Ace, and this hits a lot of two pairs. If they do have a queen, like a queen jack hand, they have a pair and a gut shot. It's a really, really, really wet board. Had this board come down something like queen 4-2, that'd be a really dry board. Not a lot of hands hit that. You pretty much have a queen or you don't. So that's an example. This being such a wet board, even though I have aces, this hits them in so many different ways. I'm going to try and get to showdown value at this point. So I do check back my aces, and we do see a bet and a call. And while this is a scary board, I'm going to try and get my showdown value with my big overpair. Overpair meaning I have a pair bigger than anything that's on the board, and make the call. 2 is an insignificant card. We see a check, and so right now we're thinking he's not that strong. He obviously hit this hand in some way. We check 2, again, trying to get to that showdown value cheap, trying to preserve our chip stack on such a wet board. And we face another bet. It's huge. And then our villain goes all in. So as we think about what range of hands do our villains have, 420 Lakers is betting into 2 people who have been calling down on this really wet board. This reeks of strength. And even though this reeks of strength, Gogo still goes all in. These guys definitely have my hand beat. I only have 1 pair. There is no way I am winning this hand. I have to make the professional move and fold the pretty aces. So I do. 8 changes nothing. King 9 comes out there. He had a king with a gut shot straight draw. And we knew 420 Lakers had the massive strength based on the action and the calling and still betting and all that jazz. There is an example of us ranging our villains correctly and getting out of the way from the ace-jack straight, fading that bad beat. All right, this is a rundown of odds versus outs. We're going to keep this super, super basic. And there's a good little cheat, shortcut for figuring out your outs. And looking at this chart, you can see if you have 1 out on the flop, you're a 4% chance to hit your hand. If you're on the turn and you have 1 out and you're headed toward the river, you only have a 2% chance. Basic shortcut is you multiply how many outs you have times 4 if you're on the flop to figure out what percentage of the time you're going to hit your hand. Or if you're on the turn, you multiply it by 2 to figure out what percentage of the time you're going to hit your hand. These aren't exact, but they're pretty darn close. Definitely close enough to use as a shortcut in game. You can see down here when we get to 4 outs, we have a gut shot straight. And on gut shot straights, we're a 16% chance to hit our hand. On the flop, 9% chance to hit our hand on the turn headed toward the river. With 6 outs, we have 2 overcards, an ace-king on a queen-high board. We're a 24% chance to hit that hand on the flop, 13% chance on the turn headed toward the river. OESD is open-ended straight draw. We have 8 outs in that scenario and a 31% chance to hit it on the flop versus 17% headed toward the river. Flush draw is 9 outs with a 35% chance to hit on the flop. Flush draw and a gut shot, you have that combo draw. You have 12 outs, and you're going to hit one of your draws 45% of the time on the flop headed toward the turn, 26% of the time on the turn headed toward the river. An example of having something like 15 outs would be a flush draw and an open-ended straight draw. We call those the monster draw. You're going to hit that more than half the time on the flop, 54%, and a third of the time on the turn headed toward the river with 33%. And it just goes up from there. We'll cover something called pot odds too next to kind of give you an example of how you kind of figure that out in relation to this without going too crazy down the rabbit hole. Let's check it out. All right, here we are with the hand example. I brought up the cheat sheet too because it's going to come into play with this hand. Also pay attention to down here at the bottom of the screen. See where it says pot odds and there's a percentage and a ratio. We're going to be referring to that as well. Check back the flop. And we pick up the flush draw on the turn. We face a bet of $27.50 into a pot of $82.50. Looking down at that pot odds number down below, it shows you that we're getting 3-1. There is just about 3 times the $27.50 in the pot. And we need 25% equity to continue in this hand to make it profitable. If we're not getting 25%, it is a mistake to call here. We will be losing in the long run. Regardless if we hit the flush on this particular hand, we want to look at poker as a whole. And so in the long run, this will be a losing play if we're not getting the correct odds. If we are, then it's a profitable play to call. And there are some moves, without going into too much detail, where you can kind of sway the odds a little bit more in your favor and pick up something called fold equity. Fold equity is we may not have the correct odds to win the hand now or draw to the hand now, but we could potentially raise this bet and get this guy to fold, which adds a little bit of fold equity. We don't have to hit our hand to win. We can also get him off the hand. So there is some of that in here as well. Looking at the numbers down below, 3-1 and 25% equity is needed. If you cut over to our little cheat sheet and look at number 9 here, we are a 20% chance to hit it on the turn heading towards the river. Where we need 25%, we only have 20. This call is a mistake, even though we made it. Even though we hit it, still a mistake. And so that is a really brief example of pot odds versus equity and how we use these percentages. We'll go into these into more depth in some further training videos, but as a basic overview, this is a good start. All right, back to our list we go. We've covered value, equity versus odds, outs, what it means to be dominated, what it means to have showdown value, how we hand range. Now we'll head into things like the bubble, hand for hand, image, and bankroll. So basically, the bubble is a spot when you're in a tournament. There is no bubble in cash or ring games. When you're in a sit and go tourney or MTT tourney, there's something called the bubble. Basically what that means is when you are headed down, you're really close to either making the money or not. There's only 10 people left, let's say, in a MTT tournament, or generally speaking, in a 9-man sit and go. Top 3 get paid, so there are 4 or 5 players left in the tournament. That is called the money bubble, and that means one person is going to be on the bubble, and once the bubble pops, the rest of the people in the tournament are going to make money, and everyone else just loses out. There's also something called the final table bubble. That is when, same situation, except you're getting toward the final table of a multi-table tournament, an MTT, and you'll notice that both on the money bubble and on the final table bubble, people start to play a little differently. They tend to get a little tighter. They try to eke their way into the money or eke their way onto that final table where the money starts to really matter, and so we can take advantage of that. Hand for hand is a situation in satellites and multi-table tournaments as a whole where as we get down to 2 or 3 people away from either making the money or making that final table, the sites go into hand for hand mode. What that means is every table remaining in the tournament, every table full of players, will have to play their hand to completion before the next hand is dealt on any of the tables that are remaining. The reason why they do this is because they want to dissuade people, discourage people from just running their clock down and timing out and stalling in order to make the money. In order to keep things efficient and moving quickly, they go into hand-for-hand play in order to combat that, because there's no reason to run it down when no one's going to be seeing any hands. And so the smaller stacks aren't going to be losing chips while you're stalling. There's no real need for hand-for-hand. Image is the way people view you at the poker table, and not about how you look, although I guess there is some of that involved. A lot of that's based on style. I have a relatively aggressive style, so people tend to fight back at me and pay me off a little lighter based on my style. And if you have a tighter style, people will respect your raises more because you're not playing that many hands. And so when you do, they're going to give you credit for having a really strong one. And when I coach my students, I try not to impose my style on any particular player. I think lots of different styles can win in this game. And it's about knowing what your image at the table is and knowing how to use it to its fullest, to its biggest advantage. Bankroll. So your bankroll is how much money you have to play poker. There's also something called bankroll management. Very, 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 very important. And it varies depending on who you ask and what site and what your ability to reload, to put more money on any one of these sites is. Assuming that you have a bankroll that's not easy to replace if you go broke. Generally speaking, in multi-table tournaments, you should have somewhere between 150 and 200 buy-ins for any particular game you are playing. If you are playing sit and goes, you could probably get away with closer to 100 buy-ins. And the same goes for the cash game. It's really important to keep bankroll management because in poker, you are going to go on swings. You're going to go on swings up. You're going to go on swings down. And when we go on swings down, we really want to make sure that we have enough of a bankroll to sustain the swing at any particular buy-in. Otherwise, we can't play poker. And there is some slight argument for the fact that if it's easy for you to lose, let's say, a $100 bankroll and put another $100 on without blinking, then you could play out of your bankroll a little bit, I suppose, in that situation. But treating poker as a business is extraordinarily important. Bankroll management, extraordinarily important. Definitely, definitely, definitely something to be aware of. Another important thing, kind of goes with bankroll a little bit, is also game and site selection. You want to play the majority of your bankroll on sites that you can beat. And there are some sites that are harder than others. There's no doubt about that. Little due diligence and research comes into play there. And game selection too. Maybe you don't want to play a hypo turbo tournament because, the blinds go up super fast. There's a lot of variance involved. Variance meaning how bad those swings we talked about are going to be, how big they're going to be in either direction. So game and site selection, very, very key to being a winning player as well. All right, guys, that brings us to the end of the terminology. Whew. It was a long one. When I started out on this venture, I didn't realize how robust this was going to be, just covering the basic of the basics. But here we are. I thought I would end up the video with some best practices. When you're playing poker, it's best not to play while distracted. Whether that's distractions because life is getting in the way, or you have Netflix going, or you're playing some Candy Crush, or something of that nature. If you are able to do that, you could probably play more volume, which is key to poker as well. Play as much volume as you can. That is the best way to beat variance, is just to play and play and play and play. With that said, if you are on a downswing and the variance is bad for you, it's also really important to make sure that you are not playing bad to compound things and make it worse. That's why joining poker coaching community like God's Big Toe Poker Coaching Community, or some other training site, or following Twitch streams, or doing the Google searching is so important. While you're playing, every site that I know of has a notes feature. You should be taking notes. It's a great way for you to pay attention at the table while you're not in a hand and keep you focused. The notes will come into play later. Most sites, you can review those notes at a later time when you play a player in some other tournament, and you might pick up on something that is valuable there. I have a note-taking video available. You can find it in the library. Definitely check that out if you need some help on when to take notes, color coding, and what color coding is, and things of that nature. Make sure you're asking a lot of questions. Make sure you mark your hands in game if you are using some sort of HUD like Hold'em Manager or Poker Tracker. As we said, study, study, study. I can't tell you how many times I hear from people, I've been playing poker for 20 years. I don't need to study. If you're not studying, the players that are really good are studying. Dan Negreanu, absolutely studying. If you're not studying, you will be left behind. We talked about the multi-table in order to get volume. And I know I threw a ton of information at you. I always tell my guys too, how do you eat a whale? One bite at a time. Watch this in sections. Watch it a bunch of times. Watch all your training material. Read all your training material. Watch it multiple times. You'll be amazed at what you pick up. And bad beats versus toe equity is something I thought I would close this off with. Bad beats are going to happen. I mean, it's just part of the game. And the better you get, you're not going to be making the basic mistakes that the average player is making. So when you lose, the majority of the time, it's going to be because you took a bad beat. You were ahead and it just didn't work out. It's part of the game. A lot of people go on what's called tilt, which is freaking out one way or the other, playing bad, getting angry, kicking your dog, whatever it might be. When you take that bad beat, the truth is if it's a bad beat, there's really not much to learn from that mistake. You get it all in with aces, get called by ace king, and they outflop you. What are you supposed to do? Not play aces? There's really nothing to learn there. Based on that, I invented something called toe equity, and basically what that is it's when I give people bad beats, because that's going to happen too. I celebrate when I give people the bad beats. We get that toe equity magic, and I don't even blink when I take the bad beats. I'm going to focus on the positive. It's better for my life. It's better for my mojo. It's better for my head. Focus on the positive. No need to sweat the bad beats. There's nothing to learn there. All right, guys. Once again, this has been God's Big Toe with God's Big Toe Poker Coaching Community. I hope you enjoyed this video. Look out for much more content to come. We'll see you again soon, guys. Peace.